Thank you very much to Ricardo for those kind words. I just hope you don't feel too let down after that. I'll try my best. I'm very happy to be here. First, a word about the title. Titles of talks are fixed well in advance, as you all know. And the title of this talk is The Dictatorship of Capital, Its Impact on Politics and Culture. But even while we were negotiating the title, the dictatorship of capital was beginning to weaken. The crisis which has suddenly struck the capitalist system is now determining everything at the present time. And it's creating a big ideological crisis for those who have been the guardians of our culture in the Western world for the last 25 to 30 years. And so we are on the cusp of changes again. So what it enables me to do essentially is to talk about what the last 25 years have done to the culture and how different groups of people in different parts of the world have reacted to it. I mean, we live in times, or we have lived in times over the last 2 decades, when an extreme form of postmodernism has led to a nihilistic negation of history, a discipline which has been extremely unpopular in the academy for many, many years. In fact, completely downgraded and downplayed. But this negation of history, I think, has had very dire effects on our culture. And I think that what it has also done is to conceal what many of the postmodernist theoreticians who've come up over the last few years don't like admitting, which is a lack of inner content in their own work. I don't want to start naming names. Yeah, well, Homi Bhabha. I could name others, but it's not useful. The thing is, if you look at their work now, it seems what it always seemed to me, but now it appears like that to many other people. Very lightweight, very superficial, very trivial, playing with words, playing with language to conceal, like the emperor's clothes, nothing underneath. Because the world has completely been changed since then. Now, what happened in the early 90s was very interesting. That it was two things happened. One, the collapse, as we know, of the communist system, so-called, the Soviet Union, and that world. And that had a big, big impact on the culture. But I think a negative impact in the following sense. That if you compare the culture that existed in the West prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, and by the way, just as a footnote, for me, to talk about art and culture in abstraction from society and history is impossible, because it is our social being, the history we experience, that determines the culture we create or the culture that we live under. It's very difficult to cut the two off. There is no Chinese wall dividing politics and culture, even though many people like to pretend that there is. It affects everything. And so the changes we saw in the 90s basically affected the entire Western world to some degree or the other. It wasn't always the same. And it was the emergence of an idea which had begun already in the late 80s, that the market could determine and decide everything. Now, this was a very strong theme in the political economy of the period, which has now come to an end with the Wall Street collapse and its effects globally. But it has been a very strong feature of politics and culture over the last 2 decades and a half, which is that whether you are, whatever you are doing, the market determines whether it's good or bad. And this has had a nullifying impact on, you can go across the board on theatres, in some cases of concert halls, of public service television networks, and one can find 101 different examples from all the Western countries to show what happened and how it took place. And the decline was sudden. One day people were being permitted to make critical programs, and suddenly the diversity that did exist in the culture went. It's almost as if the collapse of the Soviet Union and that whole world had made it redundant to have a critical culture in the West. That was the feeling, that as long as they existed, they had to be shown that we were different. That our newspapers carried lots of critical material, our television networks challenged the governments of the day, our theatres produced critical plays, our musicians were given freedom in classical music or other forms of music to challenge whatever they wanted to challenge, existing norms. But with the collapse of that system, it's almost as if a critical culture virtually collapsed in most of the Western world, and you can just measure it. I give you some concrete examples now. In Britain, interestingly enough, a new television channel had been created in the 80s, mid-80s, called Channel 4. It had been created by a parliamentary remit, a bill passed in Parliament saying that we needed a television channel which catered for the minorities in Britain. And minorities were not simply ethnic minorities, but political minorities, sexual minorities, people who challenged the existing culture. That was the parliamentary remit of the channel. And the way it was to function was like a publishing house. That there would be commissioning editors who would commission people to make films. And I have to say, because I made lots of films for them, as did many, many other colleagues, that from 1983 till probably 1993, about 10 years, this channel provided some of the most innovative stuff on British television and was repeated. The Australians created a channel like it, it's filmed so. Ricardo was talking about South America earlier. In a period where South American filmmakers and documentarists couldn't make any stuff in their homelands because of military dictatorships and restrictions, the Channel 4 commissioning editor in charge of this gave them an open house. Make your films, we'll screen them. And Channel 4 did. And a lot of the finest filmmakers in Latin America today owe a debt to what they were permitted to do. And one could go on, but a lot of these documentaries were extremely challenging. For instance, when I was called in by the head of the channel and asked to produce documentaries, he said to me, the only thing we ask is to warn us if you're going to do something that is so naughty that we might be sued. He said, in that case, do warn us so that our lawyers can help you negotiate the pitfall. And we did. We kept to our side of the bargain. And the lawyers were there to help us get stuff on the channel, which they did. And it created it began to affect what other public service channels did or didn't do. And so it was a very exciting experiment in that period. And we challenged virtually every certainty of the system in those 10 years. And it had a big impact. It had a big impact on the culture. And then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the victory of New Labour, the orders came from above. We now live in a world without conflict. And therefore, no critical or issue-based documentaries are really necessary. Why not concentrate on sex? Which the channel did. And I mean, it did it with a vengeance. And its decline was so sharp from 1997, 98 to now, that people can barely remember the channel. And when sometimes we show the films and the documentaries we made to students, media students at universities, they cannot believe that this stuff used to be on television once upon a time. Because memories are short. And especially memories on television are very short, because that whole world has changed. But it was possible. And if it was possible once, it can be made possible again. It is not the case that this system, which was imposed as a result of the changes taking place in the world economy and world politics, changes which became known as the Washington Consensus, are changes that can't be rolled back. In fact, they are being rolled back now out of necessity. I mean, who would have thought that George W. Bush would have nationalized the mortgage companies? You know, nationalization was considered something only die-hard leftists spoke in favor of. And even the NDP had become very nervous of it. But Bush has nationalized, and here New Labour in Britain is nationalizing the banks too. The bank in which the British royal family has money is now largely owned by the state. So these changes are going to affect the culture, and I'm convinced that this culture is going to become more critical. And I have to explain here that my own evolution after I left Channel 4, and the reason I left it and stopped making films was because we couldn't make the films we wanted to do. And what the market did, what I call market realism, a system that was imposed on our culture, was essentially, far from encouraging diversity, it encouraged uniformity. That was the effect of the market. So you could have 50 channels or 60 channels, but by and large they all operated within certain parameters. They didn't challenge anything. And how this affected the BBC in Britain was very dire. The BBC in the 50s and 60s and 70s may not have been great, but it actually nurtured a great deal of creative talent. If you look at the filmmaker Ken Loach, who's regarded now as probably the most radical filmmaker in the world, where did he learn his art? He learned it making documentaries for the BBC. He learned it making dramas and plays for the BBC. Same applies to Stephen Frears. Same applies to Alan Parker. The same applies to a whole number of directors who went on of different political opinions, but made quality films. That is where they learned. And talking to them over the years, one thing became very clear, that the reason they could do it was because the BBC heads of departments had total autonomy to decide what they wanted to do, especially in the creative sphere. And so, a very important right that was taken away by the market, that right existed prior to that, and that was the right to fail. That you could make a program which may not work, which may not be good, but it helped you. The thinking was that helped you to make a better one, because you then could analyze where you had failed. And public service television, subsidized theater, did this quite a lot. And it worked. I give you an example, a program you all must have heard of, Monty Python's Flying Circus. Well, two of its founders and sort of comics were friends of mine, and many years later they said, as they saw the culture disappearing, and we were talking one evening and they said, you know, we would never have been allowed to get this on the air now. So I said, how the hell did you manage to get it on the air at all? And they said, it's very interesting. We had this idea, and Terry Jones said that he and John Cleese and Michael Palin went into the office of the head of light entertainment of the BBC and said, we've got an idea. Some of them were known already, and he said, well, what is it? And they said, it's an idea called Monty Python's Flying Circus. And they said that this guy, you know, very straight-laced and staid, said, well, look, do you have a sketch you could show me? And they said, yeah. So they said we did what, you know, he said, Cleese did one of the funniest things we've ever seen. And we could barely keep a straight face ourselves while performing it. And they said, not even a smile on the BBC head of light entertainment's face. So they thought they were sunk. And he said, look, I don't find it funny at all. It didn't amuse me, but I'm going to give you money to make 6 programs and let's see how they go down. Now that was taken away from BBC heads of department. That right to take risks, to allow people to fail, because they couldn't fail, because even though the BBC is state subsidized, the license fee payers pay it, they compete in the marketplace, we are told. And so they put on exactly the same sort of nonsense that you can see on any other channel. And that right to fail that was removed has to be bought back and fought for if we're going to move forward in the years that lie ahead. And add to that, I mean, I'm talking now about drama and comedy and all this, and some good things do get on, but by and large you have to make a real fight for them. It's rare. But the same thing happened in terms of political documentary filmmaking. Something that was considered normal, and on all the big channels you had it, again disappeared. I mean, the stuff Michael Moore makes, 10 years, even 15 years ago, would have been shown on mainstream networks. It's not that radical. But the fact that he can't put it out and has to make documentaries, and some of the brightest very young documentary filmmakers are making documentaries and ignoring television altogether, which is the largest medium, is in itself indicative of something. Now, how does the rest of the world relate to it? Well, it does and it doesn't, because I've been talking about the West. And yet my own attention shifted from the West to the East after the Gulf War, 1991. And I heard a very well-known commentator saying on British television that the Arabs were a people without a political culture, which is to write off, you know, several hundred years of history. But then history is barely respected. And that angered me, and I began to ask myself the question, what happened to European Islam? I'd never been interested in religion before, any religion. But that made me curious. I wanted to know the political history of what had happened. So I went to Spain and spent 3 months traveling and saw the ruins and the wrecks of that civilization, and talked to old friends. And Juan Goytisolo, the Spanish novelist, said to me, but don't you know, Tariq, that every single thing the Third Reich did in the 20th century, we did in the 15th century. We expelled the Jews, we expelled the Muslims, we forced them to convert, we burnt them if they reconverted back to their faiths. We created the first secret police in Europe, the Inquisition, and their spies, known as the Holy Brotherhood. He said every single thing that has happened in the 20th century, you can trace back to what happened in 15th, 14th century Spain. And I then got completely obsessed with this. And when after I'd been traveling Spain for 3 months, I felt I had to write a novel about it. I couldn't just write an essay. So I sat down and wrote The Shadows of the Pomegranate Tree, which told that story, the set of stories which led to the fall of that civilization. Islamic civilization, which had lasted 700 years. And when the book was published in Spain, I was astonished by the response, because I thought it would be hostile, but it was just surprise, saying we didn't know. And then you find out that the reason they didn't know is that throughout the years of the dictatorship, the reference to the 700 years of Islamic Spanish history was summarized in the official textbooks in 2 paragraphs. They came, they crossed the water, they stayed for some 100 years, we threw them out. 700 years of history summarized in 2 paragraphs, and so I wanted to reconquer and recover that history, and I did it. And then I felt like telling the whole story and carried on writing these novels, and would have finished the quintet had it not been for Bush, who started making war. And that then brought you back from fiction into contemporary history, and I wrote Clash of Fundamentalisms and Bush in Babylon to challenge what was going on there. And it's quite funny, because I was in Spain where they kept asking me at a press conference, when are you going to finish the quintet? And I said, Bush is stopping me. And one newspaper actually headlined the next day, American president stops author from finishing it. They didn't get the irony totally and thought that a real band had finished. But visiting and discussing these questions in the Arab world and the Middle East over the last 10 years revealed something which one had always known, but it revealed it even clearer, that the links between politics and culture in that world have always been very strong, and that they don't disappear. I mean, if you were to ask me which is the best book on Saudi Arabia we should read to understand that country, I would say the novels of Abdurrahman Munif, one of the greatest novelists produced in the Arab world, a Saudi national, deprived of his nationality for writing those books, and in exile, first in Iraq, then in Damascus. One of the finest storytellers the Arab world produced. Naguib Mahfouz, another great storyteller from Egypt, who became known only because he had won the Nobel Prize. And there are many, many others who tell stories. So if you want to understand what is going on in the Arab world, you have to go to their poets and their novelists and their short story writers, especially because in many parts of this world you have corrupt regimes which prevent anything really critical from being published in the press. And one of these great poets was Nizar Qabbani. Nizar Qabbani was a Syrian poet who used to write the most exquisite love poems, lyrical love poems, and that was that was what he did. But after the Six-Day War, he became interested in politics, and then he wrote a great deal of political poems. One of his poems, footnotes to the book, or marginal notes to the Book of Setback, I can't remember the exact title, was one of the most searing indictments of the Arab leaders I have ever read. And the thing with these poems in the Arab world is that they're not just written, they are recited in cafes, they are sung by the great divas and singers of that world, and through this route they become part of the culture in a way in which poetry can't do that in the Western world anymore, with rare exceptions. And Nizar Kabani's poems were banned, but they were still being sung on the streets, and finally the ban was lifted. And then he wrote a poem a year before he died, in 1997, which I'm just going to read bits out to you, to give you a flavor of how he wrote, which is very apposite today. It's a poem which is ironic. It was written some years after his wife died. She died in a terrorist attack in Lebanon during the Iran-Iraq war, because their apartment in Beirut was near the Iraqi embassy, and pro-Iranian groups tried to bomb the embassy. The poet had gone out to buy some croissants and coffee in the morning papers, and when he came back, his apartment had burned down and his wife lay dead. And subsequently, when the first Intifada began, and children started it by throwing stones, he wrote a poem called Children of the Stones, and then later he wrote a poem on terrorism. This was written in 1997. He died in 98, years before, or some years before 9/11, so it can't be linked to that at all. But I guess, had he written it after 9/11, he might have been arrested. We are accused of terrorism if we defend the rose and a woman, and the mighty verse and the blueness of sky. A dominion, nothing left therein, no water, no air, no tent, no camel, and not even dark Arabica coffee. We are accused of terrorism if we write of a ruined homeland, the ruins of a homeland, torn, weak, a homeland without an address, and a nation with no name. A homeland forbidding us from buying a newspaper or listening to the news. A dominion where birds are forbidden from chirping. A homeland where, out of terror, its writers became accustomed to writing about nothing. A homeland in the likeness of poetry in our lands. It is vain talk, no rhythm, imported, ajams with a crooked face and tongue, no beginning, no end, no relation to the concerns of the people, Mother Earth and the crisis of humanity. A dominion going to peace talks with no honor, no shoe. A homeland where men piss in their pants and women are left to defend our honor. Salt in our eyes, salt in our lips, salt in our words. Can the self carry such dryness? In our nation, no Muawiyah, no Abu Sufyan, no one is left to say no and face the scurriers who gave up our houses, our bread and our olive oil. They transformed our bright history into a mediocre store. In our lives, no poem is left, since we lost our chastity in the bed of the Sultan. They got accustomed to us, the humbled. What is left to man when all that remains is disgrace? I seek latter-day men, all I see is frightened cats, scared for their own souls from the sultanship of mice. Is this an overwhelming national blindness? Are we blind to colors? We are accused of terrorism if we refuse to die with Israel's bulldozers tearing our land, tearing our history, tearing the graves of our prophets. If this was our sin, then lo, how beautiful terrorism is. We are accused of terrorism if we refuse to be effaced, if we throw a stone at the glass of the Security Council after the Caesar of Caesars grabbed it for his own. We are accused of terrorism if we refuse to negotiate with the wolf. America, against the cultures of the peoples with no culture, against the civilizations of the civilized with no civilization. America, a mighty edifice with no walls. We are accused of terrorism if we defended our land in the honor of dust, if we revolted against the rape of people in our rape, if we defended the last palm trees in our desert, the last stars in our sky, the last syllabi of our names, the last milk in our mother's bosoms. If this was our sin, how beautiful is terrorism. I am with terrorism if it is able to save me. Yesteryear the nationalist street was fervent like a wild horse, the rivers were abundant with the spirit of youth, but after Oslo we no longer had teeth. We are now a blind and lost people. We are accused of terrorism if we defend our poetic heritage, our national wall, our rosy civilization, the culture of flutes in our mountains, and the mirror displaying blackened eyes. I am with terrorism if it is able to free a people from tyrants and tyranny, if it is able to save man from the cruelty of man, to return the lemon, the olive tree, and the bird to the south of Lebanon, and the smile back to Golan. I am with terrorism, with all my poetry, with all my words, with all my teeth, as long as this new world is in the hands of a butcher. And so on. It's a 10-page poem. And this poem was recited everywhere. I remember when I traveled through the Arab world, the talk at the time was, did you hear Nizar Kabani's latest poem? And this is what they are forced to write because the people in these countries have no political voice. They have no political voice, and they depend on their poets, and their filmmakers, and their writers, and their playwrights. Recently, when Mahmoud Darwish, the great national poet of Palestine, died, tens and tens of thousands of people marched behind his cortege. The same happened when Nizar Kabani died. He had written savage attacks on the Syrian government, but savage. And yet, he had left a note saying he wanted to be buried in Damascus. So the permission was granted by the government. And when his cortege was followed by 100,000 people. And when Saddam Hussein was in power, there were three great Iraqi poets, two of whom are still alive, one is dead. And they were all communists of one sort or another, and had fled the country when he started wiping out communists. But he knew how popular they were and how their poetry was sung. And he kept sending messages to them, saying, can't you just come, look, I know who you are, we don't like each other, but can't you just come to do one big poetry reading in Baghdad? And they knew perfectly well that if they went to do a poetry reading in Baghdad, at least 1 million people would come to listen to them. At least, if not more. But they didn't want to go. And finally, the last time he appealed to them, one of them said to him, his ambassador, who will guarantee our lives if we go to Baghdad and recite these poems? And the reply came back the very next day. They said, our president is saying that the blood on his neck will guarantee your lives. And they said, that's not enough. And refused to go. But their poetry was read, and they, two of them who were still alive wrote the most searing, savage attacks on when the United States occupied Iraq. Because however much they hated Saddam, they hated the occupation of their country even more. And in the old days, Sadi Yusuf, who's now in his 70s, said in the old days we would write a poem and it would take a long time to reach. Now, he said, you write it on the internet and it reaches the country the next day and it's circulated all over the country and people are singing it and reciting it within 24 hours of your having written it. So he said poetry is becoming even more powerful. If you look at another part of the world where culture and politics interrelate, whether from the right or the left, it's South America. I mean, when a new novel by Garcia Marquez comes out, it is sold on the kiosks in streets in virtually every South American capital because it's considered a big event, even if it's not explicitly a political novel, which many of his novels aren't. It is considered a big event and read and grabbed, and this was even long before he won the Nobel Prize. Or the works of Mario Vargas Llosa from the right, who's a person of the right now, who stood for the presidency of Peru and became even more right-wing when the Peruvian people refused to elect him. But he is a fine novelist. So the links between these writers and politics in their country is on a similar level, I think, which it must have been, and which it was, we know, in the West in the 19th century, in the 18th century. But that sort of close link between poetry and culture and politics remains. And this returned to the West at an interesting time in its history, when music in particular became very important during the 60s. In the United States, in Europe, and this music interrelated and interacted with the politics of that period and what was going on. So I'm stressing to you the relationship between the two. And of course, when there are big upheavals in society, these are always reflected in the culture, whether it was the French Revolution and the art it produced, whether it was the Russian Revolution, and the first 3 years after it, it produced some of the most stunning works of art and cinema. I mean, if you look at the constructivists, if you look at some of the architecture that was produced in the first 3 years, maybe a bit more, 5, 6 years. If you look at the movies of Eisenstein, they were real great works of art that we can still see and watch. And would these works have been produced unless there had been a generalized ferment in society? The answer is no. Something would have been produced, but not that. And the economic ferment that we've had in Western societies over the last 20 years has produced a peculiar form of art, which, while it has produced some good stuff, I don't want to deny that, but is by and large related to money. The fact that Morisacci, one of the sort of multi-millionaires, billionaires in the art world, can go to an exhibition and buy every work of art in a student's exhibition, makes art students want to draw, want to prepare works of art which they know Morisacci will like. I once went and interviewed young artists, and they said more or less said that. They said, you know, it's a difficult world, which of course is absolutely true. And if Saatchi comes to buy everything we do, I said, yeah, but don't you see? I said, I was curating an art show, and it was one of the most depressing things I've done for a long time. Because I went and saw the works of about 30 young artists, and I didn't have the heart to be too mean-spirited about it, but they were really bad. And I finally picked 5 of them to be exhibited. But I then did question them, why do you do this? And the answer came back, because this is what people want. And this, if you like, has been the dominant thing. Give people what they want. The assumption being that all the people want the same thing most of the time. It sort of treats people as a big blob. A block without any brains at all. People all want the same thing, which is why television executives will tell you they show the same sort of stuff. That's what people want. And the result of this is that, I mean, to give you one example, you know, when I talk about a nihilistic negation of history, I also mean cultural history. A young woman being interviewed for the job of cultural affairs editor of a big BBC program, which on Friday nights discusses the culture. When she was being interviewed by the BBC heads, they said, well, and she said, and occasionally I would like also to review classical music concerts. Shock, horror. Classical music? That's not what people want. But you know, this is so deeply shocking and so completely against what the culture was after the Second World War, when arts councils were created, precisely to enable people to see, to hear, to read different things, not have exactly the same thing. and the traveling libraries that were created to go to areas where there were no libraries, to take a whole variety of books, to make concerts accessible to ordinary people so they were not treated as an elite art form, which they aren't, by the way. In some, in Spain or Italy or Greece, you have a classical musical concert sometimes and it's attended by tens of thousands of people, and operas. It's in Anglo-Saxon culture in particular that these things have tended to be treated as an art form. So the question is, what is going to happen to the culture in the period that lies ahead? And I think that this period that lies ahead over the next 10 to 20 years is probably going to pick up and become an extremely interesting period, because the certainties of capitalism have now been destroyed. What were these certainties? The certainty was, as I said at the beginning of my talk, that the market determines all. That has now completely gone. And this notion, which was used to invade the most hallowed precincts of social provision, to destroy and wreck the social infrastructure of country after country in the name of the free market. That the market would determine how the health service was run, how state-controlled, state-subsidized institutions were totally destroyed. That has happened everywhere. And the only place in the planet where there was a massive resistance to these privatizations and deregulations was South America. And it's not totally accidental that in countries where these moves were resisted by ordinary people, and the poor usually, you saw the birth of giant social movements which created new political organizations, which propelled leaders who pledged to carry out the demands of these new organizations to power in country after country. There are now 4 Latin American countries where social movements have propelled progressive leaders to power. Venezuela, first and foremost. Bolivia, subsequently, where for the first time in the history of South America, an indigenous leader belonging to the indigenous peoples of his country has been elected. And you go to Bolivia, as I do, and you see it on the faces of the people. The reforms are working. They're slow. It's not that the whole country has been totally transformed, but people are filled with hope. And they feel happy, and they talk about it. Same things happened in Ecuador, and to my astonishment, which even took me aback, the similar process has now developed in Paraguay. So why are these things happening there? Is because people protested. People said, we're not going to accept this. And the corporations who tried to push these things were defeated. In Bolivia, they were defeated in a town called Cochabamba when they sold the water off. The government sold the water off to Bechtel. And Bechtel got the government to pass a law. Just think about it. It's so surreal that no creative writer could have imagined such a law. But they got this law passed, according to which it was illegal for citizens of Cochabamba to go to their rooftops when it was raining and collect rainwater in receptacles. Now, which writer or poet or playwright could have imagined a company passing such a law? I can't think of many. I certainly couldn't have. And what happened was an insurrection. The town came out, the military was called in, killed a few people. More people came out. Finally, they caved in. And water was handed back to the municipality, and Bechtel was told to go away. And it's these moves which created a new politics and a new cultural climate in that country. Similar things. Of course, Peru didn't yet elect a progressive government, but it could easily happen. And here you had an amazing 3-month insurrection by Peruvian peasants in the most poor, poverty-stricken parts of the country, where they were going to privatize the electricity. And I remember I was in Caracas and watching the news, and they were interviewing, CNN was interviewing Peruvian peasants, saying, why are you people demonstrating against electricity privatization? Who are you people? So this peasant said, look, I'm not political, he said. It's quite interesting the way he framed it. He said, I'm not political, I'm not a member of any party. But one thing I know, that if electricity is privatized, the prices will go up. And soon, many of our villages, which at the moment have electricity, will no longer have electricity and will be forced to burn oil lamps again. That's why I'm protesting. This instinctive gut reaction against privatization and deregulation, very strong in South America, very weak in Western Europe and North America. And lessons can be learned. And this is part of one reason why it's weak is that that culture which could have defended it was more or less defeated. Demoralized, defeated. Social democracy, which traditionally used to defend these things, collapsed completely. People talk about the collapse of communism, which is absolutely true. But there was also a collapse of social democracy. And some of the people pushing through these neoliberal measures, which are now being criticized by, economists who were their most rabid defenders for 20 years, are now sort of attacking them. But it was mainly in many parts of Europe, certainly it was social democratic politicians who pushed these measures through. And what is tempting for a playwright or a writer is that many of the people pushing these measures through were formerly belonged to far-left groups. In virtually every European cabinet where these measures were pushed through, you had people who in the 60s were on the far left, who now had moved to the center, but the interesting thing is that they were defending the system and these so-called reforms with the same degree of dogmatism that they used to display in the 60s. So their politics changed, but their character and way of argument didn't, and there was a sort of bullying side to it. Especially Britain was the most disastrous event, where they basically carried on with Margaret Thatcher's policies. And this affects the culture as a whole. And we then had, during the run-up to the Iraq War, a massive row between the BBC and the British government. The Director General of the BBC, appointed by Blair, and actually quite a hardcore supporter of New Labour, and the governor of the chairman of the Board of Governors of the BBC, also appointed by Blair and a hardcore New Labour supporter, realizing that at least half the country was opposed to the war on Iraq, if not more, felt that they had to give coverage to dissent. Because they said we can no longer apply parliamentary rules as give time to the political parties, because the two major political parties are for the war. But the country, 50% of the country is opposed to the war. So what do? So dissenters were allowed on to discuss, etc., etc. And for a while there was a big debate on BBC television, where they didn't try and keep us off the air. And then there were 1.5 million people marching on the streets of London. So naturally, the event couldn't be blacked out, because it was the largest demonstration in British history. And Greg Dyke, the Director General of the BBC, wrote his memoirs, and he said the BBC was covering the demonstration live. And he said 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister's office was ringing up every 2 hours. Why are your people carrying on saying there are 1 million people on the march? And they asked the Director General, have you gone and counted them yourself? Astonishing. And he said, no, I haven't. These figures we're getting of 1 million are from Scotland Yard. They're counting it. He said the demonstrators are claiming 1.5 million, Greg Dyke said, which is probably closer to the truth, but we're putting the more conservative figures given by the police to us. And there were screaming matches and shouting matches, and finally they sacked Greg Dyke and the governor of the BBC. Blair sacked them. Now just imagine if this event had happened in a country the West doesn't like. There would have been mayhem, challenge to the freedom of the press. None of it. None of it. So the culture of a country can only thrive if there are dissenting voices. And if dissent exists, and the changes which are taking place in the universities, for instance, mainly in parts of Europe, are making these universities and transforming them into sort of Fordist enterprises, where people working in them are forced to work in a particular way. And it's created, you know, in terms of the amount of administration they have to do, in terms of amount of accounting they have to do, which is affecting the capacity of many, many people to teach properly. They say it, they write about it, and they march with their feet. They leave and go to the United States to get a job there. Some go to Australia, because they can't stand it. So one hopes that with the economic crisis that is taking place, there will be now a shift in the culture, and that this shift will bring with it and encourage a new generation. And I think that this generation probably won't need all that much encouragement from above anyway, because it will want to challenge now things which other generations accepted. And interestingly enough, it is this new generation, combined with the crisis, that propelled Barack Obama to power in the United States. All the statistics show it. 60% of those young people between the ages of 18 and 25 voted for him, across gender, race, class. Young people, the new generation, voted for him. Now, what are they going to do if he lets them down? That's the interesting question for me. I think some will accept it. Certainly within the Afro-American community, it's such a big deal. Almost analogous, not quite, almost analogous to the fall of apartheid in South Africa. I mean, it's not an ordinary thing when you know how many young black people are locked up in prison, when you know what the history of the Afro-American population in the United States has been in the 20th century. I don't even go back to slavery. In the 20th century, what that history has been. Lynchings were taking place till the 60s. Many Afro-Americans I've talked to, young and old, have said one reason they joined the army was because they felt it was safer to be inside the US Army than on the streets in their hometowns. So for them, and these lynchings were not just ordinary lynchings. If you see the photographs of them, there's a lynching, a black man is hanging from a tree, and underneath there are gaggles of white families drinking and picnicking and smiling and laughing. And this is photographed and sent out as a postcard. The book, there's a whole book of photographs now being published about this. That was, you know, Gandhi was once asked, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said it would be a good idea. And it's when you see photographs like that, that's what made me think of his remark, talking about photographs like that. Or you look at the photographs coming out from Abu Ghraib, the torture photographs, and you say, what is it that makes these people do what they do? But you know, even the Abu Ghraib torture photographs people were shocked. You recall that? Big shock. But you know, Why the deep shock? Because in Vietnam, even worse forms of torture were being carried out. And I was at a conference in Chicago, a literary conference, where these torture photographs were being discussed, you know, in a sort of slightly absurd way, and a Marine, ex-GI, sitting in the audience with white hair, said, "What are you guys going on about?" And he just electrified the audience by saying, you know, "I'll tell you what torture is. This is bad," he said, "it is appalling and it shouldn't happen." But he said the way we used to torture in Vietnam, we used to capture 2 Vietnamese prisoners, say, "Talk, tell us where your base is, tell us where you're coming from so we can go and bomb it." And when they didn't, we would disembowel one and tell the other, "This is going to happen to you if you don't talk." He said, "That's what we did." And we would drop them out of helicopters, we would do all sorts of horrific things to them. So why are you surprised that this is going on in Iraq? Why? And this is the point I was making earlier, that this negation of history actually helps to preserve a conformist atmosphere in countries, among citizens, because you don't talk about these things anymore. And this is something, I think, which is going to be challenged, and hopefully it will be challenged in the United States itself. It's a step forward to say that Guantanamo is going to be closed down, but you know, it's not just Guantanamo. We need Bagram prison in Kabul, outside Kabul, to be closed down. That's where people are being tortured. We want the Egyptian prisons, where prisoners are sent from the West to be tortured, to be closed down. Or Syrian prisons, where other prisoners are sent to be tortured, or Pakistani prisons, used by the United States to send people to be tortured. These also should be closed down. It's not sufficient just to close down Guantanamo. So what happens, I mean, one thing you see is, which is already happening in the United States, is that despite the fact that Obama still hasn't been inaugurated and hasn't yet come to power, the level of discussion in the United States already has shifted, without any doubt. And I was saying to you that Afro-American people in the United States will give him a very long road, because they are delighted. For them, it's virtually unbelievable that there's going to be a black family in the White House. Virtually unbelievable. And one can understand that. It's why in South Africa the ANC got a very long honeymoon period, even though economic conditions for the overwhelming majority of blacks in South Africa haven't improved at all. So there is Obama's victory. Whatever it does or doesn't do marks a big cultural shift in the United States. And that, I think, that cultural shift could lead to more dissent, it could lead to a different atmosphere inside that country. I mean, how could it not, after Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and this whole gang, who completely traumatized that country, frightened it. Fear was used non-stop. And part of that problem is that some of that fear still exists, the fear of the other. I mean, the character of Osama bin Laden, I mean, that is a cultural artifact now. This is one guy. Al-Qaeda is a group, even the most sort of pumped up intelligence agencies say they don't have more than 2,000 people. How can this group represent a threat, a military threat to the United States? So what is going to be the effect of Osama bin Laden's death on American culture? Who is going to be put in his place? I mean, I was in the States not so long ago, and people asked me at a meeting, at a public event, they said, you know, is Osama, where do you think he is? I said, I haven't a clue. How the hell should I know where he is? In fact, I mean, I think he may well be dead. Because one thing that makes me feel he's dead is that normally when there's an election in the United States, he makes an intervention. You know, sending a video to advise American people who they should vote for. And it's widely circulated on the networks. But this time he didn't. And there is, you know, in Pakistan, many people believe that he could have gone. but it's the role he plays that not in Europe so much, but mainly in the United States of America, that has become a problem. I'm prepared to bet you that if his death is announced, and 2 weeks or 3 weeks after his death, an opinion poll is taken in the United States saying, do you think Al-Qaeda represents a threat to us? A majority will say no. I'm prepared to bet you, because that is the threat represented by Bin Laden. So in this world now of flux and transition and change, I feel moderately optimistic that what we've experienced, the dictatorship of capital that we've experienced over the last 25 years or so, is now cracking up. And its cracking up is not going to mean that capitalism is going to disappear, but how capitalism functions is going to be discussed widely and everywhere. Because the fact of which again is discussed in elite circles, but not so much in the popular cultural media, is that the center of the world is slowly but inexorably shifting eastwards. And China today occupies the same position in the world that Britain did in the 19th century. It's the workshop of the world. Virtually everything you buy in your shops is produced in China. And it's a country which has not gone down the neoliberal path. It's a country which has not allowed its currency to become convertible, where the state has maintained a very heavy presence in the industry. While allowing capitalism to flourish, they've kept it under heavy control and regulation. And they're going to do better. So are the Japanese, who've done similar things in a sort of less sharp way, but they also have. The Japanese haven't suffered this crisis, nor have the Chinese. And that is where the economic center of the world is shifting. And and I think within the next 25 to 30 years, it probably will have shifted there. And so the effect that has on politics and culture globally, we still can't measure it, because it's difficult to imagine. Because the Chinese are very careful about what they say and what they do. One thing they say for sure is that they don't want any American military bases in perpetuity in Afghanistan, which is a country. Many other European countries did that. The Eastern Europeans did it. Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia. Wonderful stuff produced in the years between 1945 and I would say 1979. Since the 80s and 90s, the cinema too in these cultures has become extremely affected by the market. So there has been a decline. They want to mimic Hollywood. A lot of the French films mimic Hollywood. Likewise Italy. Spain is still different because of Almodovar and one or two others. But by and large, the Germans have gone down the same route. And where you see the cinema striking and remaining an art form and producing masterpieces are in countries regarded as marginal. Iran. A country, despite being run by clerics, has produced some of the most phenomenal cinema of the last 10 years. Taiwan, China, to name but three. And it's not that the films that they have produced are films which emerge just from within their own society. They have imbibed the language of cinema and its masterpieces, and they know those masterpieces very well. But these are no longer being produced in the West, but again are being produced in the East. So I would say that economically and culturally there has been a shift. Meanwhile, all one can hope is that this new situation, the new political contours which we can begin to see, coupled with the economic crisis, are once again going to produce within the Western world a culture which challenges, a culture which doubts, and a culture which dissents. Because if it doesn't, it's sunk. Thank you.